الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله نحمده تعالى ونشكره ونستعين به ونسترشده ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقائدنا ومرشدنا وحجتنا وشفيعنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كلام الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله وطاعته وأحثكم على التمسك بهدي قرآنه وسنة نبيه فقد قال الله جل من قائل أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما صدق الله العظيم. My dear brothers and sisters, you may consider this khutbah as a continuation of last week's khutbah. Last week we talked about death, and we thought and reflected on what death is in our lives. What death is in our lives, because death is a continuation or is a pathway to another phase of life. This week, I want to share with you the answer to a frequently asked question with speculations from people, which shouldn't be the case, because deen is not open for speculation. We should really know where we stand when it comes to certain questions. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us not to speculate. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Don't just say, well, I think that. No. Deen is deen is deen. And I want to share with you what are the signs that someone who is passing has a good ending for life in this dunya. What we call in Islamic terminology, husnul khatimah. What are the signs that someone is displaying a good ending? Now, there are many scholars who mentioned signs, and I counted up to 13 of them. However, those that the scholars seem to agree on unanimously are 5 signs, which I would like to share with you in this khutbah, inshallah. However, before I would continue, I want to say that not all 5 signs are to be displayed in order for us to judge. And by the way, we don't judge, we are not judges. To observe that someone is having a good ending, not all 5 of them should be seen. And not even 1 or 2. It could be 1, it could be 2, it could be all 5. But if you do not observe any of those signs, don't pass a judgment on that person and say that person is halik. Absolutely not. The scholars made it very clear that the absence of such an observation is not an indication that the person has a bad ending. It's not. So please let us understand that. The first sign, and I will mention the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that support it, and that is why most of the scholars quoted that. Number 1, if you see the person who's passing at the time of passing is perspiring on the forehead, then this is one of the signs that the person is having a good ending. As the hadith of Ibn Majah related to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wherein he says, that is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Mawtul mu'mini bi'araqil jabin," that a believer is someone who may perspire on the forehead. Number 2 sign. Number 2 sign is based on a hadith that was narrated by At-Tirmidhi, وَقَالَ حَدِيثٌ ضَعِيفٌ. At-Tirmidhi narrated that hadith, but he himself judged it as a weak hadith. But because this hadith came from different chains of transmission, according to the scholars of hadith, that would turn a weak hadith into a stronger hadith. Now, what is this weak hadith narrated by At-Tirmidhi? مَا مِن مُسْلِمٍ يَمُوتُ لَيْلَةَ الْجُمُعَةِ أَوْ نَهَارَ الْجُمُعَةِ إِلَّا وَقَاهُ اللَّهُ فِتْنَةَ الْقَبْرِ. So this hadith says that if you come across a Muslim who dies either the night of Jumu'ah, which is the night from Thursday into Friday, or the day of Friday until Maghrib time, that person will be spared the difficulties associated with the grave. And there are authentic hadith that talk about difficulties associated with that grave. And let me here just go from this number 2 to explain a little bit more before I continue into number 5, 3, 4, and 5. Now, hadith narrated by Muslim in his Sahih says that one of the daughters of a Sahabi by the name of Al-Haritha ibn al-Nu'man, one of his daughters, said, حفظت سورة قاف من في رسول الله يخطب بها كل جمعة. She said that I got to memorize Surah Qaf because I heard it so often being recited by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam from the minbar on Jumu'ah. Now, some of the scholars said that that is an indication that he used to recite the entire surah as the khutbah. Others said no, he used to recite certain portions on Fridays. Others said that no, he used to quote from Surah Qaf often. But this hadith has been in the authentic compilation of Muslim that she said, Hafiztu, I memorized Surah Qaf. And why? They said Surah Qaf is the surah that talks about life, about death, about resurrection, about musa'ala in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the day of judgment, about everything, the entire perspective of where we came and where we are heading and how we should get there is in Surah Qaf. And Surah Qaf talks about the difficulties at the moment of death and the difficulties in the grave as well. It talks about that. And in Surah Qaf, it talks about the throes of death, sakarat al-maut. Inna lil-mawti la sakarat. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that while he was in the lap of his wife Aisha, moments before he breathed his last and gave his soul to Ar-Rafiq al-A'la. He said, Inna lil-mawti la sakarat. There are difficulties associated with death. And Surah Qaf tells us that very clearly. So no room should be allowed for speculation, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَجَاءَتْ سَكْرَةُ الْمَوْتِ بِالْحَقِّ ذَلِكَ مَا كُنْتَ مِنْهُ تَحِيدٌ. The throes of death are going to come to every person, and that is the truth, بالحق. And when Allah does not have to tell us that this is al-haqq for us to believe that it's a fact, but Allah did say بالحق. So there will be, if Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced it, all of us are going to experience sakarat al-maut. However, sakarat al-maut for the believer, it's going to be in the presence of the angels of rahmah. Imagine that support. So the believer is going to feel it, but then that will be it. After that, everything is a beautiful journey. As we read in Surah Al-Dukhan, ayah number 56, لا يذوقون فيها الموت إلا الموتة الأولى. That they are not going to experience death except at that moment. Experience it. And you know what? If you will analyze the words of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what did He say about death? He said, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةٌ. You know what's ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ? That it's going to taste death. It's not experience it, taste it. And when you come across the word ذائق, or it means it will be taste it. You will feel it. Okay? As for the non-believers, فكيف إذا جاءتهم الملائكة فكيف إذا توفتهم الملائكة يضربون وجوههم وأدبارهم. Compare this with that. As for the non-believers, the angels of adhab are going to come with the angel of death. And imagine that scenario. They will be hitting their faces, they will be hitting their backs while the angel of death is extracting that soul. So let us not take it lightly. And that's what I mentioned last week from the hadith of Rasulullah that the smart person, Al-Kayyis, is that person who prepares for that moment. And you know what? It is something that you can prepare for. It is not something that you can ignore. It's either easy or difficult, but it's going to happen. The third sign of a good ending is according to a hadith narrated by Abu Dawood and Al-Hakim through the authority of Mu'adh ibn Jabal, which is a hadith sahih, 100%, everybody talks about it. لقنوا موتاكم لا إله إلا الله فإن من كان آخر كلامه لا إله إلا الله دخل الجنة. Ya Allah says, repeat the shahada, the kalima, in front of those people who are dying, because any person, any believer, not any person, I should say any person, any believer whose last words are La ilaha illallah will enter Jannah. Will enter Jannah. However, the mistake that people make is that they stand in front of his head and say, Qul la ilaha illallah. Say la ilaha illallah. Don't ever do that. And don't use the word Qul. No, you just say La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Just a reminder. And leave that person. If that person picks it up, she will say it, or he will say it. But don't say Qul. No. You just mention it. And the fourth sign of a good ending is a hadith narrated by a Tirmidhi, narrated by Ibn Majah. And this hadith is a sign of confusion for people, because Rasulullah is reported to have said, Man mata محروقا أو محترقا أو غريقا أو بالطاعون أو بمرض البطن أو مدافعا عن عائلته ونفسه وماله فقد مات شهيدا. That the person who dies by drowning or dies in a fire, or dies as a result of a plague, a pandemic, COVID, or dies as a result of cancer, or al-batn, or dies while defending his family, or dies as a result of defending himself, dies as a result of defending his property, that person is a shaheed. However, let me explain very simply that that person will be a shaheed in the books of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the akhirah, meaning that he will get the reward of the shaheed, but will not be dealt with in this dunya as a shaheed who dies in the battlefield. Meaning, the shaheed that dies in the battlefield is not to be washed or is not to be shrouded, yukaffan. But a person who dies from the other things that I mentioned, that person has to be washed and has to be do kafan. Not as some people say, well, if shaheed, then we don't have. No. Shaheed with the ajr, not with the treatment. We have to understand that. And the fifth and last sign that I consider authentic, you may have come across other signs. As I said, I came across 13 of them. But this is the last one that I found being quoted among all the scholars, is according to a hadith narrated by Imam Ahmad and by At-Tirmidhi this time. And this hadith is that, I'll explain first the meaning, that any person who dies while performing a ibadah is a good sign that this is a good ending. A person who dies while making wudu, a person who dies while praying, a person who dies while fasting, a person who dies while making tawaf or doing sa'i, in Umrah, or dies in Arafat, or dies in Mina. These are signs, or dies while taking some money to give it to some needy people. This is ibadah. So if a person dies while doing that, it's a great sign that it's a husnul khatima, as per the hadith that is narrated, and it goes like this: إذا أراد الله بعبد خيرا عسله قالوا وما عسله يا رسول الله قال أن يوفقه الله لعمل صالح ثم يقبضه عليه. So if Allah wants to give glad tidings to a person at the time destined for his soul to depart from his body, He makes him spontaneously do ibadat and do good deeds, and while engaged in those good deeds or in that ibadah, the angel of death comes and captures the soul. And that's very important, because then the person or the people around that person will know that this is a good khatimah. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم فيا فوز المستغفرين. May dua Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will accept our dua. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. الحمد لله وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. My dear sisters, brothers, if the talk about death bothers anyone, that's not a good sign. It means you really need to revisit your place in this dunya. Death is a haqq. إِنَّكَ مَيِّتٌ وَإِنَّهُمْ مَيِّتُونَ in Surah Al-Zumar. All of us are going to die. And if we do not prepare for that moment and try to be in a situation to qualify for the karamah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to put us among those with a good ending in this dunya, then we are missing a lot. Then we are not being smart enough to handle this life. This life is going to end. This life end in this phase, but life never stops. We are going to continue. Imagine, after that mawtat al-ula, you are going to go on a journey that from there on it's just pleasure, wherein even the qabr will turn into a rawdah, into a garden from Jannah. This, to really think of the pleasures of this dunya is not haram, as long as it is in halal. But to think for the pleasures of the akhirah, this is the ultimate. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وخطايانا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه، وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم علمنا من ديننا ما جهلنا، وذكرنا منه ما نسينا، وكن معنا ولا تكن علينا. عباد الله، إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله العظيم يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون. وأقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا